Hi, my name's Peter Coffin. Hey, have you ever noticed how much they talk about the women of Star Wars getting hatred and harassment? And by they, I specifically mean Kathleen Kennedy, president of Lucasfilm. Man, that lady is always talking about how those other ladies just can't catch a break. But hold on. Are the Star Wars fans being manipulated into blaming the wrong people for Star Wars problems? Is the problem actually Kathleen Kennedy? Today I'm going to answer that for you. It's a rabbit hole. It goes deeper than you might expect, so let's go. If you pay any attention to Star Wars at all outside of the exceedingly mediocre shows and movies that keep coming out of the Star Wars universe, you know that there are two things that are constantly going on. People getting all angry about how Star Wars keeps getting more and more progressive, and Kathleen Kennedy talking about how much harassment the women of Star Wars get. While I understand that if you're picking a political team, one of these things sounds more relevant to you than the other. But I'm going to ask you to look a little bit closer today and maybe consider the idea that this stuff is kind of misleading you from the real reason Star Wars sucks ass now. So let's set the scene here. Is Star Wars actually getting worse? And that's a subjective question. Of course, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. But objectively speaking, yes, it is. It's getting so much worse. But why? Is it because it's getting too progressive? Is it because the casting choices and directors are too diverse? Is that the real problem here? Well, not quite. So probably the most easy to identify criticism of post-Disney Star Wars is that there is a total lack of a cohesive vision. Much as George Lucas was maligned while he headed the franchise, he had definitive ideas as to what it was supposed to be. And whether you like the movies or not, when George Lucas was at the helm, they definitely had something to say.
A moribund imperial stage democracy is likely to transition into fascism as strongmen take advantage of the corruption in the institutions to take power. Also, I swear to God, Han Solo killed that guy in self-defense.
Now, it can be argued that the first two sequel trilogy films, if they had been given a proper conclusion, actually would have lent themselves to a decent vision. That's my argument, actually. The Force Awakens is an interesting remix of A New Hope, which gives us a few subversive elements and sets us up for some interesting twists. And The Last Jedi builds on the fact that the first movie, The Force Awakens, perhaps unintentionally, addresses the fact that unless you resolve the actual contradictions within capitalism, a new republic will simply transition back into fascism. Now, one can argue that's 2 out of 3 that you like, so the sequel trilogy, in your opinion, was good. No, absolutely not. T3 Rise of the Skywalker was terrible. And one could argue that's it for Star Wars. But I would say Rogue One is probably the best new era movie, but I hate The Rising of the Skywalker. It's a bad movie. It is paced breakneck speed. It seems to have absolutely nothing to say other than sorry, very vocal segment of the fan base that didn't like the last one, despite the fact critics and audiences rated it very well. No, we got to cater to the loudest people who are judging the entire story before we've even told the entire story. But throughout all 3 of them, they did a lot of relying on nostalgia rather than actually developing things. I can criticize any of these 3 movies for doing that. I do very specifically assert that remixing the original stories is actually kind of a good idea in the era we live in. I don't hate it, but I do think that they kind of over-relied on the fact that it's Star Wars and people love Star Wars. I remember Star Wars. Star Wars.
Remember Chewbacca again? Oh, I love to remember Chewbacca.
Throughout the 3 movies, characters that ultimately were introduced and had potential to develop into something were often sidelined for a movie or all of the movies or whatever. I mean, you could argue that Finn, Poe, and Rey, all 3 of them, basically suffered in this exact way. They do not bother with any world building that they should be bothering with in a world building franchise, maybe the original world building franchise on the mainstream level. And of course, this leads people to thinking about, oh, well, are they making Star Wars for commercial interests rather than artistic ones? You think they might be doing that? I mean, when you consider the rapid production of Star Wars content, for a while it was a movie a year, and then it stopped being a movie a year, and then we started getting shows like crazy. And depending on who you ask, some of those shows are good, or it started good, but in a lot of ways it feels like box ticking a lot of the time. And in two ways. Firstly, the way that people vocally complain about, which is the diversity one. Sometimes it does feel like they're really intentionally trying to lean into diversity rather than focusing on, what Star Wars is. I don't think you really need to make a big deal out of diversity to just do it. Like, just do it. Just cast the people and don't make that a big thing. Just do it.
Just do it!
But the other kind of box ticking I'm talking about kind of leads us back to that point about relying too hard on nostalgia. People know what Star Wars looks like, for instance, and they did more to lean into that aesthetic than George Lucas did with the prequels, for instance. Stormtroopers, check. TIE fighters, check. Empire, not necessarily called the Empire, but check. And in this box ticking, they don't really create a tale that is particularly complex or has a lot to say. Again, if you use the first two movies as setup for a third movie that actually brought everything around to a cohesive vision to have a point, I probably wouldn't be saying this, but they didn't do that. You could also argue that they have repeatedly compromised production quality for the sake of cutting costs or for getting through the production process quicker. The volume, a technology that I actually am personally very interested in, I think is very cool, the big LED walls that they run Unreal Engine on and track the camera and make it so that it looks like you're actually in a world. I think it's very cool technology, but I think it was ultimately used to the effect of, hey, we can make a lot more stuff a lot faster if we use this instead of building sets.
This allowed us to limit the amount of stage space that we used in shooting season 1 of Mandalorian, which has understandably a big impact on time and budget.
I'm not really too worried about how realistic Star Wars works. There's a bunch of guys running around with laser swords and talking about space magic and shit. It's not realistic. So some bad compositing, some less than stellar CGI. I don't care. That's not the problem. The problem is the kind of assembly line culture that lends itself to creating. And again, there is an absolute abundance of Star Wars content being released on a very regular basis. I would argue that there is a high likelihood of an assembly line culture that's been created. At the same time, Star Wars has always been used as a testbed for new technologies, but there's a couple of ways of doing that. First off, there's being innovative, and second off, there's being cheap. When you're cheap, you sacrifice not only a lot of techniques that people have grown accustomed to the way they look, but also you sacrifice time. And time is what people need to think. When I'm making a documentary, which by the way, there's one coming soon, it's going to be called Horseshoe Theory is Right, but Not How You Think. But when I'm making a documentary, one of the things that makes it take so much time is a lot of it's literally thinking. There's the writing process. As I'm recording things, I often change how it is worded. I will change points if I think that they make more sense a different way. If I can figure out a way to have less clothes on, I'll do that. But the key there is that I spend time on it. I have the time to think, oh, wait, maybe that's not a good idea. Or maybe I could do that better. That assembly line culture that I think they probably have. And the overall orientation towards tech that reduces the amount of time it takes to make stuff puts it in that direction. Other things they do to cut cost is yes, the first few of the new Star Wars movies were directed by big names. There's J.J. Abrams, there was Rian Johnson, there's Gareth Edwards with Rogue One. There's a lot of names that people know at this point. Oh, that's somebody good at directing. And it's arguable whether or not that panned out with any of those names, but they were big names who have track records of success. They didn't keep doing that. Now, I'm not saying it isn't sometimes a bold and even courageous choice to use an unknown director. when you believe that they can do it. But I don't know if I necessarily think, wow, they're doing this because they think these directors are going to show us a thing or two. I think they're kind of just finding people and bumping them up to the big leagues before they're ready for it. And it's to cut cost, more or less. That goes for directors, that goes for actors, that goes for creatives. I think there's a lot of that going on. I don't think there's a lot of care about retaining personnel or consistently using directors that make good movies to make more good movies or shows or whatever. And while some people might say, well, you're saying the directors suck, I'm actually not. I'm saying they're kind of set up for failure here, and it's unfair to them. I am competent at making documentary films. I probably could direct a fiction film, but if they called me up tomorrow and said, can you do a Star Wars movie? First off, I would think, no, I probably can't. Second off, I would say, yes, I will make you a Star Wars movie. What I think and what I say there are not going to line up. But again, they set up these new names for failure because a lot of the time the accountability, at least in the fans' eyes, rests with them. And I would argue it doesn't really. They are hired to do something, which is make a Star Wars movie. And there's very specific criteria for what people expect on that. And when I say people, I don't mean the fans. I mean Disney. That's right, it's time to ask the question, who really holds the power in the Star Wars universe? Is it the Emperor? Well, I mean, technically within the narrative, yes, it is the Emperor. But I'm not talking about within the narrative. I'm talking about like Star Wars, the thing that exists on planet Earth in 2024. So as president of Lucasfilm, Kathleen Kennedy does hold a pretty significant amount of power and has the ability to make a lot of the decisions. We'll get to what that means in just a second. So Kennedy has influence over all the franchise decisions. She hires people that she wants to hire. She approves scripts. She does all that stuff. She is a bigwig when it comes to Star Wars. That's Kathleen Kennedy's job. But speaking of what Kathleen Kennedy's job is, what is it exactly? Is it to make movies or is it to make money and maintain the position of Lucasfilm and Disney? Well, the second one. Kathleen Kennedy's job is to oversee the production of successful cultural products for the Walt Disney Company. One could argue she's not doing a great job. But let's give her a little bit of the benefit of the doubt here. What does that entail? Just like every other business, it's always going to be a balancing act between integrity and commercial interests. Kathleen Kennedy doesn't own Lucasfilm. Kathleen Kennedy is an executive. She's the president. She is the head of Lucasfilm. She is a manager. She is an employee. So while she wields power, she doesn't actually have it. If Disney wanted to, they could revoke it at any time. All major decisions, yes, go through Kathleen Kennedy, and I'm sure that she is allowed to make judgments based on her own thoughts, feelings, etc. But her decisions will always have to align with Disney's overall strategy, or she's going to be out the door. She is a subordinate. She's probably among the highest ranking subordinates, but she is a subordinate, a lackey. But if ultimately the accountability lands on the real owners of everything, the Walt Disney Company, why are we talking about directors and actors and creatives? Why are we talking about the harassment they're getting? And why are we talking about fan behavior? Why is that the focus of this? Like, you're not making money because of fan behavior. So now that we understand that situation a little bit better, where the power actually rests, where the accountability actually should stand, we do need to ask the question, why does Kathleen Kennedy keep talking about the hatred and harassment that women get? She frequently highlights the hatred and harassment, quote-unquote, diverse casting choices get. Always talking about how women in the industry got it hard. And I'll tell you, these guys that like space, all they think women are good for is slapping their titties around. So much hate they get. They get hate. Hey, did you notice they get hate? The box office is bad. Oh, it must have something to do with all the hate the women get. Now, here's the thing. I don't think that these women deserve hatred and harassment, and I do think that they get it. I think that that's not cool, and I think that people should stop. But I also think that Kathleen Kennedy repeatedly highlighting it, repeatedly pointing at those women and saying, the bad Star Wars fans who are bad, 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 they are always after these women. These women. Those women right there. The Star Wars fans hate them specifically. These directors, actors, etc., they have more public-facing presence than Kathleen Kennedy does. They're the ones that have social media and go to the fan cons and interface with the public in ways that Kathleen Kennedy does not. This escalates the vitriol. It doesn't make it better. It makes it worse. And if she doesn't get it, she should. But if she does, then she knows that what she's doing is diverting attention away from her own failures and the failures of the ultimately accountable Walt Disney Company. And again, that's her job. Remember, I did say her job is to make money for the Walt Disney Company. And I said another thing, to maintain or even expand the position of the Walt Disney Company. That may or may not have anything to do with money at all. Could be perception, could be ideology, could be whatever. And I do want to say that a lot of the decisions that have made Star Wars worse are most likely down to Kathleen Kennedy. But who's accountable for those decisions? It's 100% the Walt Disney Company. They have the power to make her do whatever the hell they want. That's her job. That's what she's doing. She's facilitating. And I'm sure she doesn't like getting hatred herself. She does get it. I'm not going to say she doesn't. A lot of people do go in on Kathleen Kennedy, but it's not really possible for it to affect her in the ways more public-facing, public-oriented personalities like directors and actors, people who have Twitter accounts, Instagram accounts, people who have reasons to get along with fans because they may at some point use fan cons as a bulk of their income. I mean, Star Wars hasn't really actually produced a lot of mega successful careers. Daisy Ridley is a good actress. I have no beef with her whatsoever, but she's also, before Star Wars, not really anybody of consequence. She didn't really have power within the film industry to negotiate anything. So you can't really lay any of the blame for her on Rey's character. The problem there is the writing. But who picks the writer? It's Kathleen Kennedy. Who does she run her decisions by before they're final? It's Disney. There is a ruling class that gets their way and should be held accountable for everything they do wrong, but for some reason isn't. Oh, right. It's because they're the ruling class. They're the capitalists, the owners of everything. Kathleen Kennedy isn't actually in the ruling class. She's just a representative of it. She's basically paid to make them look good and allegedly to make them money. Framing this through the issue of fan bigotry to make the fans the problem for what's wrong with Star Wars, particularly focusing them on the harassment of diverse casting and not showing up to movies because they hate diverse cast. That's bullshit. That is a ploy to keep the heat off of Kennedy and ultimately off of Disney. I'm not saying there is no fan bigotry. I am not saying that they don't harass people, but I am saying that the importance and amount of which is greatly exaggerated. People actually don't want to hate the protagonist of a film, even if it is a female one. Jyn Erso of Rogue One is a great example of one such female protagonist in the Star Wars world who is very well liked. Rogue One is a very well liked movie, and it is in part because of her. And it's not because she's over-sexualized or anything. She isn't, I think, sexualized at all in that film. A lot of the time is wearing pretty heavy clothing, and you can't see any of the lady lumps, and they like her still. And you don't have to stick with Star Wars. There was the Fallout female protagonist, which everybody was ready to hate. And because she was a good protagonist, everybody just loved instead. And she's definitely not over-sexualized either. There are problems with the protagonists of a lot of these shows and movies, but they're not just that they're female. It's that they suck. And there are a lot of male protagonists in the series that suck too. None of these shows and movies seem to have anything to say. They are just doing the meta. They are existing in a world that people want more content in. People making these movies are not asking the question, what are we trying to say with this thing? And they got nothing to say because the point is simply to make more of it. That's it. To make money and to reinforce culture. It's that simple. Everyone always asks, what's the solution though? That's the next question. And I'll tell you, there's no direct solution for it. You have to completely change how everything works in order to be making art specifically for artistic purposes. Either that or you got to have a wily billionaire who cares much more about the story than about making money. He's the guy who gave Star Wars to Disney for $4 billion, by the way. I don't know. What do you think they could say with Star Wars? What is something that Star Wars could be used as a nice canvas to make with? Like, what would be interesting? I think that's all I've got for you today. But what do you have for me? There's buttons down here. Lick them. Slurp all over them. Fill up that comment section with the answer to that question a second ago. And money me at patreon.com/PeterCoffin. My documentaries are up here. My other short form videos are right here. They're both, in my opinion, fantastic ways to spend the next period of time when this period of time is over. So go to those. I appreciate your time. Thanks for watching. Have a good day.